The Spin-off Podcast Network. Today, tomorrow, 20 years from now, we could die anytime. Death isn't fun to think about, just like life insurance isn't fun to buy. You won't even get to use it, but your whānau will. Depending on coverage, they could give you an epic funeral, pay off the house, or maybe even do that OE they never got round to. AA Life Cover can make the hardest time a little easier for the ones you love. Head to aalife.co.nz to learn more. For tamariki, a bed isn't just a piece of furniture. It's a place to dream and grow. But 1 in 10 kids in our poorest communities don't have a bed of their own. Donate to Variety today to help give them a warm place to dream. Head to varietyWinterappeal.org.nz to show your support.
Okay, it's July 27 today. I think I forgot to say that at the top of the podcast.
Is it July
27.
It's not July 27.
Isn't it?
Is it? No, it's July 24.
Thank you.
Don't do that to me because my son's birthday is on July 28 and my wedding anniversary is July 27 and I'm like, literally massive panic attack. Happy birthday, my son, by the way.
Kia ora tātou, this is Gone by Lunchtime. I'm Toby Manhire and I can see before me Annabelle Mather.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. And Ben Thomas, there he is, piping in from Wellington.
Morena.
How do you do?
Good, yeah.
Jay Butler is making everything work smoothly, as he
doing my
always
best.
does. We're lucky for
Pretty
him.
good.
Also, thanks to everybody who made it to our live event in Wellington a little while ago, week or two ago, at the Hannah Playhouse,
Yes.
formerly Downstage. Kim Hill was our special guest.
How fun was that?
A lot of it was
Hanging
I
out with
thought
Auntie Kim.
I was worried for you though, Annabelle, that someone might have got more applause than you at one of our live events, and whether or not that might have.
I didn't get any standing
Cut to the bone.
ovations this time. It was quite hurtful, I have to say.
You made it through. You made it through. An earlier live event we did, by the way, some months ago, was at Q Theatre in Auckland, and we had special guests on that occasion, Mihi Forbes and Jack Tame.
Oh, yeah, that was fun.
The tapes are lost somewhere in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean for reasons unknown. We did, though, have a bootleg recording of Jack Tame speaking.
Oh, nice.
And I don't know, are we able to play that now?
I don't think either Joe Biden or Donald Trump will be the next president.
Clever little pumpkin. Hey,
So that was some many months ago,
what a matakite.
and he might be right. He might be right. I have noticed, I don't know if you have detected this, that there has been no punditry, certainly no podcasts that have covered recent developments in American politics. So I thought we could break that drought and be the first people to provide our analytic eye.
Shine a
across-
light, eh?
Yeah.
Highlight underreported issues. I'm all about that.
Exactly that. And it began just under a month ago when Joe Biden gave that disastrous debate performance, was unable to speak, really. And then there was an assassination attempt some weeks later, which people seem to have forgotten a bit, in which Donald Trump was narrowly avoided being shot. Shocking. And then in the last few days, Joe Biden stood down after a lot of pressure, and Kamala Harris is now emulating the Jacinda Ardern story, sort of, and is having a good time of it. Your analysis, high-level podcast pundits. Ben, you first.
Yeah, well, look, this is a salutary warning, I think, that if you don't see a politician in public for around 6 months, they may be clinically dead already, and it's probably it's probably not a good idea to try and revive them during a live debate for the US presidency. I was watching that on Matariki, a public holiday. And right from that first answer, it was clear, this was untenable. This was, a real shock that they had sort of hid his decline for so long. And even more inexplicable that, having tried to keep that from the public, that they thought that the best opportunity that he had to win the presidency was to draw attention to the contest between him and Donald Trump in a live debate. And I think that set in motion, what we've seen now. It really did sort of take on a kind of weight and gravity of its own. I think there'll be a lot of people asking questions. Christopher Luxon has said that he will cut down his media appearances on Tuesdays from 3 to 2, only doing the caucus and the morning media rounds, and won't be doing the bridge run stand-up. What has he got to hide?
Annabelle, it is amazing how quickly momentum can shift in politics, isn't it? That it was looking all done for all money. And suddenly, again, as the only analysts of events in American politics, it seems like things have shifted.
I mean, honestly, I'm actually not an analyst of American politics, but I did go to Disneyland in the 80s, so I have a pretty good idea of how things work. It was surprising because he seemed so resolute that he would stand, and then he got COVID, and I wonder if he was able to, pop a battery in his hearing aid and realise that everybody was screaming at him to resign. I don't necessarily think that Harris is going to be the silver bullet that the Democrats are looking for. I think she faces some major challenges. 700,000 Democrats voted uncommitted in the primaries, which is bad news for them. They need them in those swing states. And the problem that she faces is that she's seen as being very closely aligned to Biden's policy when it comes to Israel and what's happened in Gaza, and it's costing them the support of Muslim voters who are a key bloc in states like Michigan. And young voters, people of colour, it's a popular issue in the US. Even the majority of Jewish voters there want to see an embargo on arms being supplied to Israel. However, we know that she's very strongly supported by AIPAC, and so it'll be interesting to see whether or not she starts to distance herself from Biden's policy so far, or if she's going to continue down that line. And if she does, I'm not sure that she will make it over the line. We might see another Trump presidency.
I read somewhere she was declining to appear at the Senate when Netanyahu was speaking, or speaking the next few days. I don't know if that signals anything. My pick is that J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate with Trump on the ticket, is going to be such a deadly bore that Donald Trump is going to personally start attacking Vance, and that'll all collapse on that side. You mentioned Luxon, Ben Thomas. He recently gave an interview when he was in the US to the Financial Times, and that prompted another round of the Helen Clark and Don Brash show, in which they repudiated what they saw as a pivot, or in fact, and I think in Helen Clark's word, it's a hard reset in terms of New Zealand's foreign policy. There is, for all that's going on there, the favourite clearly remains Donald Trump to return to the White House. His platform, which includes distancing from NATO, introducing tariffs on just about anything that moves, and flipping the bird at the rules-based order generally, whether it's a hard reset or a pivot, is that a good time to be moving more towards putting all of our stock with the American alliance?
Yeah, we might want to hold off probably for about 105 days. Just to, say, look, we're getting to it in the queue. The AUKUS application. I think we lost. Could you print it out again?
We've got to deal with the milk powder issue with the Aussies first, right?
Look, it is, and there's no easy answer to it, because that doesn't solve the problem of Chinese strategic ambitions in our region, but it does, significantly, because a lot of concern and risks for New Zealand, both strategically and in terms of trade. A Trump presidency, if he went through with the agenda that he's promising, and all of the sort of chatter is that he's a much better organised kind of ticket this time, with people around him who can get things done, whatever their merits. That would be a real worry for us. There's no real way around that, except for, all we can hope is that, the predictions of Brat Tame come true, and that neither Trump nor Biden become the president.
I think the challenge that Trump has is that although when the assassination attempt first happened, everyone was like, this is it, he's going to win the presidency. I do think the potency of it will wane over the next 100 days. But the other thing too is, the thing with conspiracy theorists is that they tend to self-cannibalise. So I think over the next 120 days or whatever it is, they'll spin themselves round and round in circles, and they'll end up on the opposite side of the fence. So I don't think that it's as cut and dried as perhaps we thought in the days after the shooting.
It was very funny watching in real time as Donald Trump in his RNC speech lasted 15 minutes doing the USA unity, I'm a president for all Americans. And he lasted 15 minutes, then he just went back to the boilerplate stuff, to the usual stump speech, and started having a go at everyone, and then doing the run. He just can't help it. It's just so funny.
So now it's a crime to effectively process grief quickly.
Okay.
He talked it through with his closest friends, the Republican National Convention, and he's moved on. I mean, this is an exemplar of talk therapy working.
Hey Ben, bringing it back to New Zealand, because I know you've got to go shortly. Another board has bit the dust under the Luxon government. This time, Te Whatu Ora, which I think, admittedly, its board had been already whittled down to 2. And Shane Reti and Luxon appeared at the start of the week, and Reti said that Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand was heading towards a $1.4 billion deficit by the end of the financial year. And they were installing Lester Levy, who's been around health governance circles forever, as a commissioner. Is this, and then there's been a tit for tat back and forth between Reti and Aisha Verrall, the former health minister, over who's to blame for what's going on with the health system in New Zealand. It does seem like a hell of a cluster. What's your view on, is this the solution? Is it a trying to fix the plane, trying to rebuild the plane while it's flying situation?
Yeah, look, in my work, we've had a bit of dealings that have sort of interfaced with Health New Zealand, and then I've talked to a number of other people in the sector over the sort of course of its existence. And the overwhelming sense is just of confusion, that people don't really know what's going on. When Health New Zealand was, and Shane Reti has pointed this out, it was probably a pretty bad time to do a massive overhaul of the health system while they were actually still in the midst of dealing with a pandemic. But this sort of centralisation, all the idea was to turn 23 DHBs into one organisation, which would improve coordination and, end the postcode lottery, that kind of thing. But it doesn't seem that really much thought was given to how the organisation would run, and that was sort of almost wholly turned over to the board. The board had its own problems. Rob Campbell resigned before he was sacked, basically, after his sort of political comments, which was a problem because now board directors of Crown entities have to adhere to the same sort of code as the public service. I think there was a real lack of accountability there. The minister sort of said, well, it's the board's responsibility. The board doesn't have that sort of day-to-day insight into how the health sector works or how the organisation was functioning. Chief executives seem to just be going on hiring sprees in the back office and admin roles, and there's obviously unnecessary there's probably necessary duplication because of all the systems you've got to try and bring together, and essentially nothing was getting done. All of the commissioning that it was meant to centralise and make more efficient and more rational, it just hasn't been done. They've been rolling over the previous contracts for the last couple of years now, and it really does show the dangers of kind of, looking at a wiring diagram on a PowerPoint and saying, that's the health system I want, because that doesn't really tell you how it's going to work in practice. The light at the end of the tunnel is that Les Levy's very good. I've had a bit to do with him. He's extremely experienced. He was the chair of a number of DHBs back in the day, and is very focused on productivity, but also sort of getting better outcomes. That's part of how he sees productivity is getting equally good outcomes for the people who are currently at the bottom of the heap.
I mean, the restructure is complex. Obviously, health systems in any country are these crazily convoluted systems, Annabelle. I guess there are two separate things, right? Like, one is getting the restructure right. The other is whether or not doing that correctly will suddenly create all this money. Whether there's Christopher Luxon has talked about the middle management mush, I think is the word he used. And Levy has said there's some bloated middle management in there as they try and smush together all of these DHBs into one organisation and then move them into these 4 separate kind of regional units as well. Is that money there, or is this just the story of health, which we know continues to cost more with an ageing population, with more medicines coming online? Is it really just a reality that we need to find more money for an ailing health system?
I think, people who work in health would say that the system is chronically underfunded, and when you look at a per capita breakdown of what is spent in New Zealand compared to other OECD countries, we spend nowhere near enough compared to others. Now, I know that you can't compare to like the US because their health system is whack, but you can look at places like Canada and the UK, and it is not unique to this government or even the government before. It's been going on for decades. I think Lester Levy is, again, a very competent operator, hugely experienced, all of those things, but he's not Superman. This is a health system that employs, is it around 82,000 people? Like, it's an incredibly huge workforce. I'm sure that there is bloat in there, but this was always going to be the problem when you rolled all of the DHBs being rolled into one mush. In terms of the last board that was there was, I guess the benefit is that when you've got one person running the show, you can move a lot more quickly, but it's a lot more plates for him to keep spinning. And it makes me wonder, like, how many of those former board members were prepared to sign up again for another term. Is this potentially a face-saving exercise by the government because they knew that a lot of those board members didn't want to have another ride at the rodeo? I mean, it's an incredibly high-stakes job. They've been given a hospital pass because the planning by Labor was so poor. You don't get paid a lot of money, and people's lives are literally at stake. So, I think it's probably quite disingenuous on both the part of Labor and National in terms of what we're seeing playing out now.
A quick word, Ben, before you go, and then we will release you into the wild on the emissions reduction plan. The consultation document has been released for the second version thereof by Simon Watts, the Climate Minister. And the news is, the top line is, we're going to hit 2026 to 2030, all good. However, the trajectory beyond that is less good. Not going to meet the the target in the budget for 2031, I think it is. And the plan to hit net zero by 2050 is, it's curling away from that. This is in part things like TY being back, being extended, but also some policy decisions that have, by the government, that have affected the ability to hit those goals. Should we be worried about this?
Yeah, and this is, I think, this is the first sort of, one kind of like little tremor in the government's kind of key, one of the key planks of it, which is basically using an ETS first sort of approach. And the idea is that if you have an emissions trading scheme with a sinking lid, that caps the number of emissions there can be, and then the market will just decide where those are most efficiently allocated. And that was the basis of a policy document written by the very bright Chief of Policy, Matt Burgess, for Christopher Luxon, just before he came back over to the Nats. He finished that off for the New Zealand initiative, sort of the case for just using the emissions trading scheme, or at least using that as the main part. And that's then been the basis of their climate policy. The only issue is that because that means, probably swings in prices in the market, it can become politically untenable. And I think that, you're seeing an indication of that with the emissions reduction plan, where they're saying, well, we're not really prepared to let the cap fall down to zero because of the economic outcomes that would, come out of that. We want to keep New Zealand relatively economically prosperous while heading towards net zero. That's the idea is that the idea of bigger spending governments is that you can bridge that gap with sort of programs to incentivize behaviour, subsidies like the New Zealand steel smelter deal that the previous government did, $100 million, but will end up reducing a large number of emissions. And that hasn't been this government's style, both for fiscal reasons, they're short of cash, and philosophically. So it's going to be tough. Simon Watts is a very conscientious minister, but he's working within those constraints. They've said there will be some future announcements to talk about maybe getting that gap down to zero. Maybe that's policy they're still working on. But yeah, it signals, I think, the trade-offs that you've got to make here politically, which may end up unpalatable if they stay the course on ETS only.
Yeah, and as we have Sydney and Brown moving to try and expedite the four-lane highway in the north, which there are strong arguments for, Annabelle, lots of the priorities seem to run up against the climate change ones. Like, for example, when Ben mentions whether there's some big announcements to come, what about electrification of the rail line throughout the North Island, for example? Where does this leave us in terms of climate as a priority?
Well, we've been criticised recently, but because of our climate strategy, that it's far too over-reliant on the planting of pine trees to trade away our emissions. It's a high-risk strategy for a number of reasons. Firstly, we've had, I think it's 4 auctions now, where our units have failed to sell. The money from those units were being relied on to pay for things like the tax cuts and all of that. So on one hand, you've got a market that appears to be collapsing. Secondly, in terms of the reliance on pine trees, if that's our main strategy, and it is, the problem with it is that you're kind of gambling that climate change won't get to a point where we end up with like droughts in New Zealand that massively increases the fire risk, because once those forests go up, you actually have to pay back all of your carbon units. And then the third part of it is that we're locking future generations of New Zealanders into dealing with these huge pine forests. You can't cut them down because, again, you lose your credits and you have to pay them back. As we see on the East Coast, every time it rains, they cause even more damage. So you can build new roads, but if they're going to get wiped out by pine trees roaring through a gully, it's not very helpful. So we're taking a huge gamble. It's coming at a cost to future generations, and it doesn't deal with the primary issue, which is how do we reduce our emissions. So we're in a difficult situation, I think.
I mean, the saving grace, I think, just before I duck off, is that if we have a Donald Trump Jr. presidency in 2050, I think the rules-based order will have sufficiently collapsed that we won't have to pay any of our debts under the Paris Agreement. So,
I mean, maybe we could shift direction, like, you know, that place in Mount Eden that sells the beautiful Christmas trees. Like, if we become the Christmas tree exporting nation, maybe there's something in that for us. And we'll use electric
tariffs.
boats
That's the only trouble.
Yes, yeah.
Yep. We'll send them to India under our new free trade agreement. So,
perfect.
yeah. Okay, I'm out. I'll see you guys.
All right.
Thanks,
Ben. Okay.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
30 years ago, a young teenage girl had a secret sexual relationship with her youth group leader. Now she's ready to revisit the past.
Where we're coming up to now is a place that I have not been to in 30 years.
This is one survivor's story of reckoning with the past, whatever the cost.
It's going to be so full on, eh?
The spin-off presents Dear Jane, made with support from New Zealand On Air. Listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Right, it's July 24, 2024, and today the long-awaited Royal Commission on Abuse and State Care is published. So we're holding off putting this podcast into world until 4 p.m, which is when it's tabled in Parliament. 6.5 years ago it was announced, Annabelle. Jacinda Ardern announced that Royal Commission, the sort of highest grade of inquiry, really. But that came after years of lobbying and petitions and pressure. And it's one of those subjects which I think a lot of people very understandably kind of go, oh, that's important, it's hard, and they don't sort of engage in it. I'm guilty of that a fair bit too. It's a lot. It's very harrowing.
Yeah.
133 days of hearings over the course of these inquiries, and a lot of them were streamed, and you can watch them, and boy,
yeah,
they're heartbreaking. There's so much anguish and so much pain. At the same time, there is something positive about it, about the whole process. The
harrowing is the right word, Toby. It's harrowing.
I think more than 2,000. I think more than 2,000 testimonies. So anyway, today's a really big day. I'm gonna, if you'll indulge me, I'm gonna read out the first 5 numbered paragraphs of the report, or it's a series of reports really, because there's reports and then there's case studies, which and then speckled throughout it are there various other sort of survivors' testimonies, which I think that is really important. They've tried to make sure that this doesn't sort of seem like a sterile kind of academic account, but one that is centered in that way. Anyway, I think it's worth hearing. So number 1, state and faith-based institutions were entrusted to care for many children, young people and adults. New Zealanders held the leaders of these institutions in the highest esteem. These leaders had a duty to nurture, protect and help people flourish. They failed in their duty. Instead of receiving care and support, children, young people and adults in care were exposed to unimaginable physical, emotional, mental and sexual abuse, severe exploitation and neglect. Abuse and neglect were widespread throughout the inquiry period in state and faith-based care institutions. And that period is 1950 to 1999, which was then extended, I think, at a certain point. Any abuse and neglect, let alone the prevalence of it, could not be justified by the standards of the day and certainly cannot be justified now. Critical rights, such as those guaranteed to Māori in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and human rights that should have protected people in care, were ignored and overlooked altogether. Number 4, paragraph 4, of the estimated 655,000 children, young people and adults in care from 1950 to 2019, it is estimated that 200,000 were abused and even more were neglected. The true number will never be fully known, as records of the most vulnerable people in Aotearoa, New Zealand were never created or were lost and, in some cases, destroyed. It is a national disgrace that hundreds of thousands of children, young people and adults were abused and neglected in the care of the state and faith-based institutions. These gross violations occurred at the same time as Aotearoa, New Zealand was promoting itself internationally and domestically as a bastion of human rights and as a safe, fair country in which to grow up as a child in a loving family. If this injustice is not addressed, it will remain as a stain on our national character forever. Now, that's just a very short kind of introductory passage, but I think it contains, some sense of what we're dealing with across these many thousands of pages. Annabelle, the word stain is used there. People talk sometimes about the scars on our nation. It's actually a wound in a way, isn't it? Like it's a wound that persists, that endures today, because part of this is, as those involved have been keen to stress, it's not something that is solely retrospective. It's about something that continues to this day in terms of its impacts. Like 200,000 people. I mean, that is this massive part of the lives of New Zealand.
And even that 200,000 is really an understatement, because those 200,000 people went on to live lives where they had partners, children, nieces and nephews, friends, victims, and they came from whānau who were also wounded by their loss. It's important to know that not all of these children that were put into state care came from abusive homes. A lot of them just came from whānau in crisis, often economic crisis or the death of a parent, that sort of thing. So when you start to think about the number of, the children of these people and how it impacted their relationships and their loved ones, it's so much bigger than that. And it really tells the story of the whakapapa of so many things in this country, gangs, crime, domestic violence, poverty, educational failure, all of those things.
The final report, there have been interim reports before, and among the recommendations that are included in this final report calls for apologies from the government and a range of other agencies, including churches. Many will have noted that Jehovah's Witness had a 11th hour attempt to suppress the references to their own past in this report. That was chucked out by the courts last night, but you're very welcome and encouraged to go and look at the accounts of Jehovah's Witness, particular contribution to New Zealand in this regard. There's also, in 2021, I think it was, in an interim report, there was a call for a redress system, Peretumu Toru Whānui, and there is a discernible, I think, mood in this report that comes through that was described as urgent then, there was no reason not to crack on with that and get it done. Chris Hipkins was on the radio this morning saying that, yes, more should have been done, but they were trying to co-design with survivors, which is all very well. That's really important, isn't it? This is the next kind of big important stage, is having a system of redress for survivors.
It's so interesting how when people come to understand what happened to these children, you know, they are empathetic, they are ashamed of how the state behaved, but as soon as you start talking about compensation, people are like, I don't know about that. How are you going to divvy it out? And how do you know that they were really abused and there was a very low standard of evidence and all of those things? But the reality is that it's the very least that we can do. It won't go anywhere near to compensating them for all that they've lost emotionally, mentally, culturally, all of those things. Labor did drag the chain on this. I think they could have got there a lot quicker. But, you know, these are people who were doomed to a certain standard of living because they essentially had their education stolen from them. That's before you even get into the emotional stuff about, you know, their mental health and their wellness and their ability to have a relationship with their whānau. So, I mean, of course it makes sense that they would receive some economic compensation because we owe it. We literally owe it to them. We doom them to, you know, in many cases, people not being able to hold jobs or, you know, attain educational qualifications or any of that sort of stuff. So my ardent hope is that when people, when politicians, when they read this report, that everyone's able to just lay down their weapons and, you know, look at this with a lens that transcends politics or their own personal interests as New Zealanders, and really just try to do the right thing by this group of New Zealanders, because ultimately we will all benefit from that.
We're talking, as I mentioned earlier, before the report is tabled and it enters that public domain and political conversation. I should direct people to thespinoff.co.nz, where we've got a bunch of stuff planned that will be there if you want to kind of get a summary of the recommendations, the responses, and it's worth revisiting to a project called The 250,000, which explores lots of the stories. If you feel like it's time to look at some of those, it's really impressive work that was done by the team at the Spin-Off. You mentioned the hoping that people will approach this in a certain way. Are you optimistic? I mean, are you optimistic that this won't become part of some of the political discourse that we've seen already in the last year or two?
I'm always optimistic because that's just my nature, but I fear that people will use some of the recommendations and findings to, you know, weaponise this information for their own political gain. And that's a real shame, because I think we let ourselves down, we let future generations down if we do that.
I mean, it's notable that one of the case study documents is entitled Boot Camp, which obviously is an issue today, where we've learned that I think 9 out of the 10 people in the pilot scheme
are Māori.
And so even with the best will in the world, and I don't doubt that, to be honest with you, that they are hoping that this is not a repeat of the repeated failures in the past in trying to do these things. Some of them appalling failures. You look at what happened on Aotea, on Barrier.
Oh God, yeah.
But you know, it's not. It's the dots aren't difficult to join, are they? I mean, while there was some resistance about calling them boot camps, the government has used the term boot camp to describe them. There is a sense of a kind of an element, or appealing to an element in the public psyche of wanting retribution.
You know, in my view, like, great leaders are people who are able to keep an open mind and are able to set their egos aside, when something that they believe in or a kaupapa that they're pushing has been proven to not be great. Like, there's real mana in that and real power in that to be like, I think that this was a great idea, but actually now that we've seen some of the data and the evidence, it's not. And I really hope that the politicians that are committed to these boot camps will just take the time to read about, what has happened in the boot camps of old. That's the thing. Nobody intends to do damage. Nobody sets out to ruin the lives of people. But when you are uninformed, when you're ideologically married to an idea, that's what can happen. And, I remember Mihi and I made a program about state abuse survivors about 6 years ago called Ngā Mōrehu. And one of the things that they talked about was how you have a social worker and a pedophile all wrapped up into one thing. And I remember when we first started talking to these guys, I was like, what are the chances to have a pedophile and a social worker in the one person? But, then you come to realise that actually, idiot, people who prey on children, they're like moths to a flame when it comes to these things. It's like whenever you get some little club that's rich in cash, you'll always get some shady dude that comes out of the shadows and ends up ripping it off. That's just how these things work. And so when you're creating these military boot camps, it doesn't just talk about boot camps, so it also talks about how a number of the people who ran these homes came from military backgrounds and therefore took a very punitive approach to dealing with children, the language they use, the violence they use, the hierarchy that they instilled and how damaging that was. So you can set up these boot camps with the best of intentions and you think they're going to be great, but ultimately you're going to draw people into them who do not share your good intentions, who are there for an entirely different purpose. And you're in Wellington, you have no way of knowing that. You're running a high trust model that everything's hunky-dory. And if we are to read these reports, we will know that we are dooming future generations to more trauma.
It's so hard, and it's so it's so painful to work through so much of this. One thing in terms of the political response is worth noting. I went back yesterday and was watching the announcement of the Royal Commission, and it was Jacinda Ardern and Tracy Martin, who was Minister for Children, and Ardern said that Tracy Martin had persuaded her to upgrade it to a Royal Commission, that they had been working towards a lower level of inquiry, but Tracy Martin had been so passionate about this issue. Tracy Martin, former New Zealand First MP.
I didn't know that. Amazing.
Tracy. That Tracy is no longer in Parliament, but let's hope that there is a little bit of cross-party comity and a shared push to try and go to the next stage in a way that's constructive.
Pretty powerful legacy for those two women, I think.
All right, that's enough. Thank you for listening, and we will return to discuss more of the things in another podcast in the future. I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.